the view of Darwinian selectionism really can capture thinking, and it takes hold, and it's very, very hard to eradicate once it is in there. It's easy to get in. Survival of the fittest seems to make sense, but it shapes your whole view of good and bad, who should live, who should die, what is right, what is wrong. It colors all of that in every single way.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Creation Podcast, the show where we discuss the science that confirms Scripture. I'm your host, Trey, and this is part 2 of a 3-part series. And as I'm sure you can tell by the title of this particular video, we will be discussing some pretty heavy and sensitive topics. So I just wanted to give a heads up that we will be discussing things like genocide, racism, eugenics, and other adjacent topics. But it is important that we discuss these very real historical events and the cultural and scientific climate that allowed these things to take place. So let's begin. From 1941 to 1945, Nazi Germany and its allies systematically murdered 6 million Jews in a genocide known as the Holocaust. At the time, that was approximately 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population. Alongside the Jews, others that were deemed inferior also suffered during the Nazis' reign. This included the Roma, the Polish, people of Slavic descent, black people, those who were mentally unwell, and the physically handicapped. But why? To what end? In this 3-part series, we're taking a look at the roots of the Holocaust from a scientific perspective, as well as the Darwinian undercurrent that allowed all of these things to happen. In our last episode, we discussed the thought leaders and philosophers that set the stage for the atrocities of the Holocaust. In this episode, we're going to be diving more into the specifics of scientific racism, eugenics, and attempted genocide as practiced by Nazi Germany. And I have with me today Dr. Randy Galuza, president of the Institute for Creation Research. Thank you for joining me again.
This is an important topic. We really need to discuss it.
Absolutely. So, last episode, again, we discussed all those thought leaders that allowed these things to take place. So let's get into the nitty-gritty a little bit. So Hitler used the idea of eugenics, brought about by the scientific elite at the time, to support the idea of a pure Aryan society. So in his mind, just like Count Arthur Gobineau said, the German people are the best people. That's where he was living in. And in his manifesto, Mein Kampf, he said, while nature only allows the few most healthy and resistant out of a large number of living organisms to survive in the struggle of life, people restrict the number of births and then try to keep alive what has been born, without consideration of its real value and its inner merit. Humaneness is therefore only the slave of weakness, and thereby, in truth, the most cruel destroyer of human existence. So, from my reading of this quote, I'm getting this is very much like, as we had mentioned in the previous episode, the idea of the medical practice, saving those who are sick or ill. We shouldn't do that. That's what Hitler's saying, right? How does this fit into the picture?
Well, it is the natural outworking of the Darwinian worldview at that time. And really, we need to make those links that we were producing in the last episode. So for anybody watching this, you really need to go to the previous episode to get the basis of all of that, as we discussed the leaders and the thoughts. But to just sum it up, it's not very broadly evolution. And we as creationists have not been talking about this precisely enough for the last several decades, actually probably since the beginning of the creationist movement. It's not broadly evolution. Someone might say, well, how in the world does evolution lead to a Holocaust? What's the link there? They can't see that link. And frankly, I wouldn't see the link either until you drill down and you see the basis for the evolutionary thinking. So it's not broadly evolutionism. It is specifically selectionism. It's a world view, which is a fundamentally death-driven worldview, which is based on Darwin's notion of natural selection or survival of the fittest, or as he said, that in any one generation, there are more people born into it than resources available to them. Therefore, they must compete and exterminate one another for the few remaining resources of which the best, the fittest, would survive. And then as we saw in our last episode, that was extended to racist thinking, where humans then became stratified into superior races and inferior races of people. And then the next step was to allow only the breeding of the best and the control through positive type of eugenics of selectively allowing certain people to breed, and through the negative eugenics of sterilizing and euthanizing and aborting those which we don't think should breed. And that now is really setting the stage for this whole final Holocaust. But the links to get there go back to survival of the fittest and Darwin's selectionist worldview, eugenics, racism, and all these things fitting together. And as you mentioned at the beginning of this section, it was, you called it the rise of racism. In reality, it's the rise of scientifically sanctioned racism, because we've had racists all along, but now you have this authority which has come on the scene. Science has sanctioned this racism through a whole host of things, but primarily through the idea that humans evolved from lower types, and therefore there are still these lower subspecies of humans that are out there. So you have a scientific sanction to it, which we can't de-emphasize how important that was enough. We can't de-emphasize enough just how powerful that is, that people, when they hear science is backing this up, science is telling us this, that sanction there of science, it really allows them to remove the moral restraints on a lot of things. It allows people to placate their conscience, because this has got to be good and it's got to be the right way, because science is telling us that. And particularly when it's going to do something bad to another person, it removes the stigma of you being a murderer, of you being someone who will torture, of you being someone who will experiment on another person to their pain and detriment. Normally there would be, your own conscience would be bothering you, but there'd be a stigma from society. What kind of person are you to do that kind of thing? And so this scientific sanction, it does kind of like placate the conscience and reverse the stigma from something bad to something that should be done.
It allows you to do what the science in quotes says, right? And I think that it's important here that we notice in this quote from Mein Kampf, Hitler doesn't even mention race, but it does lead to race eventually with the stratification. I think that it's important to take a look here at the first steps that Hitler took, that Nazi Germany took in making a pure Aryan society, and that was to remove those judged to be mentally or physically deficient. Now, racism aside, why does the physical and mental deficiency portion of this, why does that matter to making a pure society to Nazi Germany?
It does, because those people were viewed as detriments to society, because they were viewed as carrying defects. They weren't necessarily called genetic defects at that time, because people weren't really thinking in terms of genes back then, but they were considered birth defects, physical deficiencies, which in some cultures are tied to the lack of blessings of God upon you, or the influence of evil influences. But in this society, it wasn't seen as that. It was just seen as, oh, you have it. We don't need that in society. We need to eliminate that.
Right. Wow. Okay. So I see here, it began with children. I have this story here of Gerhard Kretschmar. I don't know how to pronounce that 100% accurately, but So this was an 11-month-old blind child who had deformed limbs. His parents were ardent Nazis, and they petitioned Hitler to euthanize their own child. And this was the first one. This was the first euthanization of at least someone who had already been born as far as Nazi Germany went. But it really opened the door to further atrocities in regard to disabled children. And there's a historian, Wendy Lauer, who wrote, "The first Nazi mass murderess was not the concentration camp guard, but the nurse. Of all the female professionals, she was the deadliest. Centrally planned mass killing operations began neither in the gas chambers at Auschwitz-Birkenau nor in the mass shooting sites of Ukraine. They began instead in the hospitals of the Reich. The first methods were the sleeping pill, the hypodermic needle, and starvation. The first victims were children. During the war, nurses gave thousands of deformed babies and disabled adolescents overdoses of barbiturates, lethal injections of morphine, and denied them food and water." Why children, I guess, is the question. I think that at least here in America, in our modern society, there are people who are like, oh, I'd rather be childless. But like, and there's the arguments around abortion typically, but we're not going to talk about that here specifically. But at the very least, there seems to be this idea of, once a child is born, it's a human. It is a living human and deserves to be protected. What is different here when it comes to children?
Well, everybody knows they're human. That 11-month-old child, everybody knows they're human. Mm-hmm. The parents of that 11-month-old child knew they were human. The nurses know they're human. And that's really an important small step to getting to the Holocaust. The Holocaust didn't go in one major leap. Mm-hmm. It was a series of small incremental steps on that. Having some people mate with each other and have children, that's easy to do. Okay, you would think there's something a little seedy about controlling this kind of stuff, but you're not manipulating things.
It's not inherently evil, it seems.
Exactly. It doesn't seem inherently evil. And then the next tiny step is you sterilize them, but you didn't kill them, right. You didn't maim them, you didn't do away with them, and so now you have to go to the step of killing humans. So it's a big step to kill a perfectly healthy person, just go out and murder them, particularly when you want to do it on a wide scale. So you have to take the step of murdering humans somewhere, and children are the prime target for all kinds of reasons. One, they really don't have a voice. Mm. They're weak. They're kind of defenseless, particularly when they're very, very young at that. There. Two, people can morally justify it in their own mind. Well, look what life they would be suffering through if we let them live in those areas. So we're really doing them a favor by exterminating them at this age and not letting them live. How fair is it to let someone with malformed limbs go through life and have to struggle all that ways? You're consigning them to a really, really hard life. The next one is look at the rest of society, particularly their parents. You're consigning them to all of this heartache and woe, and the child may eventually die anyway on these things. So for all of these justifications, reasons, you've now made that next tiny step, but a very important one, to where you are actually killing human beings, killing them. And as you mentioned, we're not even at race yet.
Right.
But you've crossed a threshold, and there's really no going back, because now you're actually using your scientific and your medical implementation to take another human life.
It's a big step. It's a very horrid step. But I think that it's important to note here, we talked about, the scientific sanction, and genetic defects in their mind were in the German eugenics movement and thought. these genetic defects were thought of as manifestations of different civilizations. Like, oh, that's a piece of another ethnic group that we need to trim off of our perfect Aryan social tree. And so it does really give them, in their mind, the right to do it, the moral high ground, as we mentioned in the last episode.
Right. And talk about something so unscientifically sound. I mean, now we know that is ludicrous.
Yeah.
It is scientifically crazy to be thinking along these kinds of lines, but they saw it. And as we mentioned in our last episode, it goes back in many ways to Ernst Haeckel's thinking of phylogeny recapitulates ontogeny, and that we still had these remnants of our evolutionary past that we went through during our development, and they were still in our hereditary material, whatever it was at that time. They didn't know exactly what it was, but it was there, and it could be inherited, and it could be passed on, and it was one of those impurities that one of the other gentlemen we spoke to spoke of racial hygiene needed to be cleansed out and excised from the population.
So in this selectionist culture, right, we're talking about selectionism. We're talking about this tree. I kind of mentioned it earlier, these branches. So at this point, they felt the need to trim this genetic tree, if you will. They felt the need to get rid of these blights. So we see here, it starts out with the genetic faults, and then it moves to racism. Like the shift is huge, because it's not like, oh, this person is less than genetically because they have a deformity, which, as horrible as that is, you can at least say, well, they wouldn't produce anything from a society perspective. You know, they would live a hard life, like you mentioned. But then this moved into racism. And why do you think that it went from genetics first to racism versus racism first, then genetics?
Well, because people can justify in their minds killing somebody who has issues, and that particularly they think are not going to live, and so they even do it today through abortion, and people get specific counseling if they believe this child is going to have these defects, that it should be aborted, and they are strongly urged to abort this child, which leads into another step. It's a small step, but it's an important step that is all along here, which is going to get to the racial aspect of it, or the cultural aspect, and that is that there's a higher good. There's a higher goal to be attained, that we're doing something good for society. And this harkens all the way back to Darwin's selectionist worldview, because in his worldview, it wasn't just a competition to survive for scarce world resources. As we mentioned in the last episode, there's an upward trajectory to it. It is that competition, that struggle, that extinction, that extermination of one group in his view. We know this doesn't happen, by the way, parenthetically, in real life. One group exterminating another group, which ultimately led to the higher animals and humanity as well. So there was a good goal. There was a higher goal at the end of his struggle to survive. And the parents of this 11-year-old boy, I can only imagine that they have to be able to justify this in some way. We are doing something good. There is a higher good to society. These nurses, there's a higher good to society, and then you get a broader and larger buy-in for people that there is that eliminating these impurities through this struggle to survive is ultimate leading to a higher good. And in their view, not just strictly for the German people, but for humanity in general. And that ties right back to Darwin's selectionist thinking. There's an upward trend, There's a goal to that trend. Humans have been suppressing it, repressing it through humaneness and interventions by allowing unfit people to reproduce, and now it's allowing unfit people to even live on that. Therefore, we need to get back to our roots. We need to get back to our evolutionary selectionist background, which was driving humanity on an upward trajectory, and reinstitute that for the good of humanity in general.
Okay. So there's this idea of perfection, evolutionary perfection in the German mind at this point. And they tried, sterilization. They tried, euthanasia of children and then adults. And this was, like you mentioned, all under the sanction of science and medical progress. It's hard to overstate that this was considered good. We view it as the atrocity that it is. But they thought that they were doing the right thing. They thought that this was the way to go. This was the way forward. There was an underlying current of, the authority of science. Let's listen to science because science has the answers.
That's right. In their view, science is the method, and still is in many people's minds, to enlightenment. Science is the route to truth. And some would say the only really legitimate route to truth is through science, and definitely not through revelation or religion. I mean, that needs to go out. And something that probably should just be mentioned here as well is the Nazi view was not just antagonistic towards Jewish people and the Poles and the Slavs and others that you were mentioning. It was also very antagonistic towards Christianity and Christians as well. Anybody who would have this idea of humaneness or another source of truth that would be a competitor with their source of truth. So even Christians were on the docket. They weren't as high on the list, but they were on the docket. And if the Nazi regimes had not been defeated, then Christians would have also been suffering the same fate of that. I guess what's really interesting for me, though, is how there was just this mental disconnect from when I was a kid learning things. When I would see documentaries of these masses of German troops, and you've seen them, there's just thousands and thousands of them, and they're just marching along, and they're very militant and very angry and hostile in their view. I was taught they're just mad because they were defeated in World War I, and they thought they got a bad deal out of the treaty that came out of that, and it drove the country into ruin, and therefore, out of vengeance for World War I, they were up in arms and were going to take revenge on the Allied powers which had defeated them.
But the Holocaust has nothing to do with the Allied powers itself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So where was that teaching? When I was going through school, I wasn't exposed to it. And I now know why. It's because you can't teach the evils of selectionist thinking while being a selectionist yourself. You can't teach the extension, the evils of the evolutionary worldview while holding to evolutionary principles yourself. Therefore, you will divorce, you will erase that bit of history from it because you still want to advance the selectionist and the evolutionary ideas even today. Therefore, you won't talk on this. You'll talk very, very broadly about it, and you'll give a very sanitized view of history, which eliminates all of that. But now I realize it eliminated the link to the Holocaust. Like, how do you go from being defeated in World War I to exterminating people groups?
Right. Those are two very unrelated
They're
things.
two very unrelated things, and what we're talking about is the link that's explaining how that happened.
And it's not just a Hitler thing. And we discussed a lot of other thought leaders prior to Hitler, but racial theorism was a big deal at the time, and there were a lot of people who believed that Caucasians in general and Germanic peoples in specific were the highest form of humans, which is just kind of wild to me. That there were people from other, like you mentioned in our previous episode, they weren't at the bottom of the list. They were Caucasians, but they weren't German, right? And so they're like, oh yeah, Germans are the people, but it's not going to affect me because I'm close enough, but they were building up this idea of, this racial hierarchy, and they thought that the other races were just flat out inferior. And how does that lead into the Holocaust? I mean, like you said before, we've had racism for time immemorial, but why is it that racism here, thinking that you are the most advanced here, lead to, the eradication of people groups instead of, helping the other people groups?
Oh, well, helping would have been furthest thing from their mind at that time, without a doubt. And as we mentioned in our last podcast, one of the leaders was speaking about racial hygiene on that. And because of the concept of racial hygiene, you can't allow coexistence.
Okay. Because
their view is the other people groups were inferior, but they were also infectious. Because people can breed with other people can mate with other people can have children with other people groups, and therefore these other groups are like a lingering disease. They're in humanity, but they always pose the threat of infecting the pure groups. And so racial hygiene was really an important concept in their thinking of cleansing out this infectious element in humanity in general. And that's why Darwin said, as we mentioned last time, that there would be this sure but certain extermination and elimination of these people groups. And he saw it happening. I don't know whether he envisioned it, probably not by force, but he certainly envisioned it as eventually taking place as the superior ones eliminated the less ones.
Right.
Hitler saw it in a completely different way. He saw force, and force was the means to do this, and therefore war became a key element in his worldview, that war was the natural outworking of this racial type of hygiene. In fact, I'll just read what one historian said about him.
Sure.
This is from Fritz Redlich. In his 1998 book, Hitler, Diagnosis of a Destructive Prophet, says that Hitler came to view history as the struggle between the races, in which the strong defeat, dominate, or destroy the weak. A vulgarized view of social Darwinism in which war plays a fundamental role. This notion became the center of Hitler's worldview and eventually contributed to unprecedented destruction. And it wasn't just any type of war. It was an inhumane, all-out, total destruction, elimination of people war, because Hitler had said, even in Mein Kampf, in nature there is no pity for the lesser creatures when they are destroyed so that the fittest may survive. And so his view of war was not just conquest. I'm going to take your land and I'm going to get your resources. His view of war is one culture dominating and eliminating inferior cultures, which means that those people needed to be eliminated. They would be subjugated and eliminated as time would have played out if they hadn't been defeated by the Allies.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So war, World War II, we have, according to Hitler, probably the time is ripe to enact what's going to happen. And so Jews were considered racially inferior. And there's probably some other things going on. People have discussed, why did Hitler hate the Jews so much? There's other pieces there, but they were considered racially inferior. and they were a mortal threat to the German race. And so they brought together what was termed the final solution, and this included a lot of high-level German officials. The final solution to the Jewish question was what it was called. This was not a discussion of if the Jews should be eliminated, but how and when. And so the goal was to wipe out approximately 11 million Jews in Europe. I have a quote from, this is Reinhard Heydrich, chief of the security service. During the course of the final solution, the Jews will be deployed under appropriate supervision at a suitable form of labor deployment in the East. In large labor columns, separated by gender, able-bodied Jews will be brought to these regions to build roads, whereby a large number will doubtlessly be lost through natural reduction. Any final remnant that survives will doubtless consist of the elements most capable of resistance. They must be dealt with appropriately, since representing the fruit of natural selection, they are to be regarded as the core of a new Jewish revival. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that is selectionist thinking in a nutshell. Of course, the natural reduction he's talking about is that they're going to work them to death.
Yeah.
And they're going to work them hard and feed them little, and they'll eventually die from being worked into the ground on that. So that's what he means there. But the one somehow, some way, which could make it through all of that, then they were a real threat, because in their thinking, they were the fit of the fittest. Mm-hmm. And if they could endure that, then they could probably endure most anything. And I mean, they probably don't like you if you've worked their brothers into the ground, and then therefore they would pose a threat. Mm-hmm. And if, in their view, these people have offspring, they'll only be breeding of the fittest, and therefore they posed this mortal threat to them. The view of Darwinian selectionism really can capture thinking, and it takes hold, and it's very, very hard to eradicate once it is in there. It's easy to get in. Survival of the fittest seems to make sense, but it shapes your whole view of good and bad, who should live, who should die, what is right, what is wrong. It colors all of that in every single way. A few years ago, I wrote an article, and we could even post to it. I know you'll probably point to it there. Survival of the Fittest and Evolution's Death Culture. And it details, not going back to Nazi Germany, because I assumed everybody knew about that, but it's detailing everything that has followed since then of how this selectionist view leads to this culture of death and this death-driven worldview altogether. And so we've taken all those little tiny steps to where you are going to selectively breed, and then you are going to sterilize, and then you've crossed the threshold to where you're going to kill people, deformed people in their view, but they're going to kill them.
And children.
Nonetheless on that. And then you implemented wholesale war. That war is the natural end of man, as one group eliminates the weaker. And the answer, I guess someone should say, where does that end? It doesn't end. It just continues to go on and on and on in this worldview, and now they're actually implementing it. I think you said their goal was 11 million. Mm-hmm. 11 million people that they had no tinge of conscience. They were just going to eradicate them.
Absolutely. And I think it's wild to me that in this quote, that he specifically says, representing the fruit of natural selection. It's right there. The man who is discussing the implementation of one of the most horrible atrocities that has ever occurred in human history, he talks about natural selection as a part of it. And so I think that's why we're doing these podcasts. Like, that is where selectionist thought processes lead.
Right. And they can lead that way today.
Yeah.
There's nothing special about us that we couldn't go right into this same type of thinking as well. In fact, I know I wrote another article. You can probably link to it as well. Boom. It was right at the very beginning of the COVID crisis. I think there was like 20, 30,000 people. I don't remember the exact number of Americans had died from COVID-19. And sure enough, someone came in and said, this is just natural selection in action. So I wrote an article about this, that we're just eliminating the weak. It's totally natural. We have these kind of epidemics every generation or so, and they take out the weaklings, leaving a stronger, better humanity in its wake on that. And I pointed out all of the linkage on why this man is thinking this way and why he's even saying such things. And he's not someone of my age and older. He's someone younger than you who's already thinking this. So the young people that are watching this podcast, make the links. The links aren't not necessarily to evolution broadly. It's to this survival of the fittest, this death-driven worldview, this selectionist mentality.
Yeah. So that leads us to the fruits of the Holocaust, the foul fruits of where selectionist thinking leads. And so I think it's important here to discuss who were the victims of the Nazi regime. We talk about the Jews, 6 million Jews. Horrible. They weren't the only ones. So on top of 6 million Jews, we have somewhere between 250,000 to 500,000 Roma people. We have 250,000 Germans with mental or physical disabilities. Tens of thousands of members of the Polish elite were either killed or imprisoned. 3.3 million Soviet soldiers. An unknown number of political opponents, Jehovah's Witnesses, Christians, gay men, and others accused of homosexuality. I read that was a common thing if you didn't like someone or if someone was even thought of it. There's no physical manifestation of any of that. So you could just claim that someone was a homosexual. 6 million European Jews, of course. All of these victims died due to the ideas of natural selection and racial purity and survival of the fittest as introduced by Charles Darwin.
Exactly. On that, the whole idea of selectionism introduced by Darwinism, as we read in our last podcast, the stratification of races as introduced to this, species and subspecies on all of this. And I think as we've even documented in this episode here, the steps, the links, it wasn't in a leap. It was tiny steps, boom, 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 but all of them going ever and ever closer to this whole idea of eliminating masses of people. Mm-hmm. And it's really a complicated thing. It's not just selectionism itself. It's the sanction of science, which allows people to placate their conscience. And as we said even earlier, reverse the stigma of being from someone who would have been seen as barbaric and totally inhumane, that to someone who was seen as doing something good for society and humanity in general, just a complete reversal of all of those kinds of things. But I think and this is another one we shouldn't forget, the influence of the elite leadership and the deference of people to that elite leadership as well. But as we ended last time, this is not just merely an academic history lesson. This is a warning. It's a warning to all of us because this thinking is still in society. We still hold to survival of the fittest. I guarantee you there'll be hundreds of articles of the tens of thousands written today which will reference it in some way or another. Survival of the fittest. It permeates our society. It's still in our thinking. It still leads us to do things with unborn and preborn children and older people in society who we think have gone past their usefulness to us in some way, that they need to be eliminated. So younger people watching this podcast, be warned And if there's something that you need to virtue signal about, virtue signal that you're on the side of life.
As a bit of an aside, when it comes to terminating unborn or preborn children, it was recommended to my mother to terminate her pregnancy for medical reasons with me. And if that had happened, I wouldn't be here today having that conversation with you. And it's a big deal. It's a big deal in America. It's here in our homes. And I know that there are people from other countries watching, but the majority of our audience is from America. So it's here and it's everywhere. So it's just something we need to be aware of. Do you have any final thoughts before I say goodbye to all of our viewers and listeners?
Well, I'm obviously thankful your mom didn't listen to that advice, and you're here with us today and such a valuable part of the Institute for Creation Research. This is a huge topic. There's lots and lots of material on our webpage on it, far more than we can even cover today at icr.org. I know I myself have written at least a dozen articles related to these kind of topics as well. And they're all very well documented with far more information than we even have time to cover in this podcast. Mm-hmm. So I would encourage people, particularly the young people, get educated in this. You have an opportunity to have information which I was not exposed to, but I wish I would have been exposed to. It would have changed my thinking as a young adolescent coming up in a non-Christian home for them. So anybody listening, this is important information available to us. It's something that is so valuable to know and so vital for today that you really can't go through life uneducated on it.
Well, thank you so much for joining me again. I look forward to part 3 of this podcast. Part 3 will be a little lighter, thankfully. Yes. So I'll see you then. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you to all of our listeners and viewers. Thank you for joining us for part 2 of this 3-part series. Of course, I mentioned that we will have a part 3 that will air in 2 weeks, so make sure to tune in for that. You can subscribe, share this video. This is an important topic, and this information needs to get out. I think that sometimes we just kind of think, oh, the Holocaust happened in the past. It won't happen again. We know that that's wrong. And we do to an extent, but that selectionist thinking works its way into other aspects of our life. And so we never know where this might lead. So I just thank you for tuning in. If you want to get this podcast a week early, or you want to get our monthly podcast, creation.live, 2 weeks early, you can become a member here on YouTube or on Patreon. And we'll see you next time on the Creation Podcast. We want to say a huge thank you to our members and patrons. If you'd like to see your name here and unlock perks like early access to our podcasts, members-only polls and live streams, behind-the-scenes footage, or exclusive video content, links are in the description below.